And we'll allow a few more minutes for people to join us.
Yes, sir.
But yeah, we will be getting started promptly at around 6:05. I don't know if anyone could hear that.
Mm. Mm. Here, I never missed you today.
And if you're just joining us, we want to ask you to please mute yourselves before we officially get started, everyone. But welcome, welcome, welcome. So again, before we get started, we do want to ask everyone to please mute him, her, themselves. We're going to be getting started in roughly about 2 minutes, everyone. So we thank you all for being here. So again, welcome everyone. We're going to get started in roughly about 1 minute. So thank you all for being here. We are asking everyone to, while you're here, please mute yourselves. We're going to give you an opportunity to ask questions. You can put them into the chat, but we're going to hold questions till the end of our remarks. But again, thank you all for being here, and happy Fair Housing Month.
All right. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to Fair Housing in the time of COVID. My name is Asian Brown. I'm the Community Engagement Specialist with OHR. So I'm glad you all can make it in this important discussion tonight. And without further ado, I want to turn it over to our director, Nin Kai, who's going to provide some welcome remarks. So Nin, you.
Thank you, Asian. Good evening, everyone, and happy Fair Housing Month. I'm so pleased to welcome you to our first event for the month, celebrating and hopefully raising awareness around fair housing laws. As you know, the Federal Fair Housing Act became law in 1968 after decades of unconstitutional segregation actions, which included things like redlining. This, of course, wasn't just about racial inequality, but outright inhumane denial of a human right to housing, when the government and private individuals alike unlawfully prohibited African Americans from owning real estate or occupying residence in areas reserved for white Americans. Over 50 years later, today, many people think of fair housing laws as an equal opportunity or equal access law only. But if we're going to make true progress, we must remember our history and acknowledge the heinous acts of our past. Moreover, we must remember individuals like Harvey Clark and his family who dared to push boundaries in the suburbs of Chicago and the terrible fate they suffered at the hands of a racist society and our then government, not only acquiescing riotings and destructions of properties, but condoning these acts and lodging civil charges against Mr. Clark and his family for daring to exercise their human right to housing. Fortunately, in 2022, in the District of Columbia, under our DC Human Rights Act, we have over 18 protected traits on which a person cannot be denied access to fair housing or equal enjoyment of fair housing. These protected bases include things like the way someone might wear their hair, their gender identity or expression, source of income, and being a victim of domestic violence, to name a few, in addition to federal coverage of things like, of course, race, color, national origin, sex, and so forth. I note here that today, over 50 years later, under the Federal Fair Housing Act, source of income is still not a protected basis under that law, but it is a protected basis in DC, where people cannot be discriminated against, cannot be denied access to housing because of the source of income, which includes using government subsidies and vouchers and the like. I can go on much longer, as Asian probably knows, to talk more about these protected bases, but Asian Brown, our training specialist, will go over our laws in greater detail in just a few minutes. But I would be remiss if I didn't share with you that in enforcing our expansive coverage under the Human Rights Act, OHR has issued multiple guidance documents on issues like, what is source of income discrimination? How does criminal background screening work in housing? By the way, that's unlawful until after a conditional offer of housing. There are more details, so read our guidance. How about what does affirmative action look like in fair housing? We have a guidance on that. So I'm pleased to welcome you to our discussion this evening on not just fair housing, but fair housing during COVID times. As you know, COVID has impacted our lives in unprecedented ways. It's put strain on existing inequalities, especially in employment and housing, the two vital building blocks necessary in life. As a city, we have been resilient. We've stuck together, responded to crisis with compassion, caring, and kindness. We've all done our parts in fighting against this pandemic and all of its various phases and forms. OHR has been with you each step of the way. Not only does our office enforce all of these great anti-discrimination, human rights laws, but we issue guidance documents to help enforce these laws, as I mentioned earlier. So with respect to COVID-related documents, I want to share with you that OHR has recently updated our COVID leave guidance that talks about your right to take leave for COVID-related issues. And Asian will drop a link to that guidance in a moment here in the chat. We've also released, as I mentioned before, a fair housing guideline on not only furthering fair housing during COVID, but the affirmative efforts we can take during COVID. So I think I might have taken enough time in making the welcome remarks, so I'll stop here and just thank you so much for coming out to this much needed panel discussion. And I want to thank our training specialist, Asian Brown, our esteemed panelists, as well as the person behind the scene here, Mr. Tyler Cargill, who's supporting us this evening for our tech. And I'll just hand it over to Asian for the rest of the program. Thank you, Asian.
Thank you, Director Kine. Thank you. So now I'll just briefly go over, give you a sort of a highlight of what OHR does, and then a brief history of fair housing in our country. And Director Kine did a great job of summarizing, the need, the necessary, why Fair Housing Month is so, and fair housing laws are so important in terms of access to stable housing, and what that can mean for a family. And so, or an individual. So, I'm going to do my best to, briefly give you an overview of what, the history of fair housing. But first, I want to just do some housekeeping. If you aren't speaking, if you could please silence your mics, that would be much appreciated. We want to hear your questions, but if you could please drop them in the chat. We're going to have a Q&A session after the panel discussion. But we want to be respectful to our panelists and their subject matter expertise and what they have to say about this topic. But we do want to hear from you. So if you could pop your question in the chat, or if you're on Facebook Live, you can post to the board. We will be monitoring those two channels and going through and curating some questions for the Q&A session. And be present, be willing to participate as comfortable. Again, that's mainly in the form of asking questions. But if you like to have your camera on, you can. If you want to be on camera, you can. You don't, that's totally understandable. And then, so I did want to also just FYI, we are streaming on Facebook Live. So this is a live event. We're also recording this for future use on posting on a YouTube channel. So I did want to put that out there. So you're not confused if you see yourself on YouTube. You're now famous. As Director Kine was saying, our mission, as the Human Rights, Office of Human Rights in DC, is to eradicate discrimination, increase equal opportunity, and then protect civil rights through our enforcement. And we do that in a number of areas, including employment, public accommodation, educational institutions, and of course, housing. And one of the main mechanisms or laws that we use to enforce these civil rights is the DC Human Rights Act of 1977, which was a very progressive at the time human rights legislation that protected, I want to say, 16 protected traits in that initial bill. So it already was, much larger than the 7 that are protected federally. And that comes from a lot of different, there's a lot of different reasons behind that, but one of the main ones is that first council that served the district, once we got home rule, was a lot of civil rights activists on it. And so they understood fully sort of how important anti-discrimination laws were, and enforcing those things effectively could be and mean for people. And so I think that is one of the reasons why we have such a progressive human rights track record in our city. So in particular to fair housing, we investigate and process complaints of alleged discrimination in housing. And for housing complaints, we rely on the DC Human Rights Act of 1977, which has 18 protected traits total that are protected. And then the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968, and then those amendments. So these laws prohibit, these different things, and that includes refusal to rent, sell, or finance because of a protected trait, deny or limited services or facilities because of a protected trait, the failure to process or communicate offers accurately because of a protected trait. And if, again, you'll see that a lot of them have to do with being related to a protected trait. And FYI, everyone on the planet belongs to a protected trait. So no matter what sort of you identify as, or you are protected, under the Human Rights Act. That also includes discriminatory terms, conditions, or privilege. So imposing different rental prices, for example, or using different qualification criteria, for example. So those are just some of the things I wanted to highlight that we sort of see in our office a lot of times. So just wanted to point those things out and what the sort of laws, what kind of protections do exist, and that we kind of see on a daily basis. So here's a brief timeline of sort of fair housing. So in 1789, that's a private property rights was passed, and essentially allow people to own private property because of, after post-war, it was the government's right to sort of take property and seize it for whatever use they wanted to. So that allowed people to, again, own private property. Then there's the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which allows certain people to basically own land at that point. Of course, obviously not everyone is included. And I do want to point out that this is a brief history of fair housing. Not all of it is, we don't have a great track record of fair housing laws, but that's the reason why we're spreading this awareness and having these conversations is, again, to further that conversation and see what we can do in the future to include everyone basically in that that fair housing component. So there's also racial zoning outlawed in 1917. In 1948, restrictive deed covenants were declared not enforceable. So a lot of deeds, and Director Khan touched on redlining, which was a practice, to exclude largely African-American Black populations from owning in prosperous or, up and coming developments. So that was also, is similar to the restrictive deeds where, whole communities would basically restrict and not allow certain kinds of people to own property in their developments. Then in 1968, of course, there's the Fair Housing Act. So again, that does come from decades-long activism and work. And then in 1975, there's the Voluntary Affirmative Marketing Agreement, which just adds sort of more fuel to the Fair Housing Act, so that people are, affirmatively marketing fair housing instead of, just passively, taking trainings and things like that. And then, of course, in 1977, that is where our DC Human Rights Act comes in play. And again, this includes 18 protected traits as opposed to the 7 federal protections that are protected federally. So that's pretty much it for me in terms of the housing or the history of housing. So now I want to turn it over and I want to really get into, why we're all here tonight to hear from the panelists and have this discussion about COVID and sort of how it's impacted fair housing. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Jeffrey May, who's our moderator tonight from International Development and Planning. He's a fair housing expert and has been in this work a long time. So he's here to guide you through this night and having this great discussion. So.
Thank you so much, Mr. Asian Brown. And also thank you, Director Ninkind, for actually allowing us to be here and be a part of the Office of Human Rights Fair Housing Month event. So again, we want to welcome everyone here and happy Fair Housing Month to everyone. You are in for a wonderful treat. This is going to run roughly about an hour and a half. So we ask that you stay with us the entire time. We are going to ask you to hold your questions to the end. However, you are welcome to type your questions into the chat. However, we will not be addressing or answering those questions until we get to the question and answer sessions. So why are we here? It's Fair Housing Month. It's important that we increase awareness about fair housing all across the district and all across the country for that matter. So I'm very fortunate to be here and to be supporting this wonderful event as a moderator. We have a wonderful slate of panelists that I'm going to introduce and allow them to introduce themselves in a moment. But I do just want to remark a little bit about fair housing and its importance. So under Maslow's hierarchy, food, shelter, water, obviously housing is really important. It's not just important because it's the place where we house our things. It's a place where we have wonderful memories. We raise our children. We actually share many experiences with our loved ones, friends, and families. But it also actually can determine where you work, how close you are to work, where your children go to school. So something that is so important should not be controlled or guided by anyone else. And not only should it not be controlled or guided by someone else, but there are actually protections that actually exist for you across the country and specifically here in the District of Columbia. So again, as it was shared by Mr. Asian Brown about the Office of Human Rights and its services that it offers, we want you all also to take information that we're going to be talking about in terms of how COVID has impacted us as members of the community. And we want you to be ambassadors and share that information with others. So we again want to thank you all for being here and being a part of this wonderful Fair Housing Month event. I now want to actually just do a brief introduction of the panelists and let them introduce him, her themselves. Tonight, you're going to hear from fair housing advocates, housing professionals, tenant rights advocates, and realtors as well. So again, there's a lot of wonderful information that's going to be shared, not only their observations and things that they can share based upon their experiences, but also equally important are the resources that are available. If you find that any of the things that are being discussed this evening that sound familiar to you, that may actually run afoul of the Fair Housing Act or specifically the Office of Human Rights Fair Housing Laws. You saw that the 18 protected classes, the Federal Fair Housing Act only has 7. So you are truly resource enriched and fortunate to be in a part of the country that one has a fair housing assistance program. That's what the Office of Human Rights is. It's a FAP. And to have an entity that actually has a very broad list of categories and protections that go beyond those that are covered by the Federal Fair Housing Act. So with that, let me just quickly introduce the slate of panelists that we have. We have first, it's going to be Evan Lee Marbury. He's a real estate agent with Compass Real Estate. Tjuan Stevenson-Woods, she's a housing counselor with Housing Up. Mr. Michael D. Mitchell, he's a fair housing consultant also with International Development and Planning. I would say, I might add an expert, such an expert on fair housing, fair lending matters. And Cristobal Puig, coordinator of Office of Tenant Advocate. And also we have Director Nen Kine that's going to be with us offering, and also Mr. Adrian Brown from the Office of Human Rights sharing and chiming in as well when we speak about fair housing matters and fair housing issues here in the District of Columbia. So with that, I'd like to start with Mr. Evan Lee Marbury to say a few words about who he is, and also importantly, since it's Fair Housing Month and why we're here, what does fair housing mean to you, sir?
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. My name is Evan Lee Marbury. I'm the team lead for the Legacy Group over at Compass Real Estate. Been doing this a while. And for me, fair housing really allows me to assist everyone, regardless of who they are, where they come from, gender, income, or any of the other protected classes, in finding them their place and their piece of the pie in this crazy city and the surrounding areas. And that's what it is for me.
Thank you so much. And now let's go to Ms. Tjuan Stevenson-Woods from the Housing Coordinator from Housing Up. You have the floor, ma'am.
Yes.
And what does fair housing mean to you? I'm sorry about that.
No problem. Good evening, everyone. I want to say happy Fair Housing Month to the panelists as well as the guests who decided to join in. My name is Tjuan Stevenson-Woods. My pronouns are she and her. And to me, fair housing means equal choice of residential opportunities for all. Being in DC, we have more protective traits than any other place that I've lived. And it is a breath of fresh air to know that the residents of DC are truly being taken care of. And I want to thank OHR for being a part of that.
Outstanding, outstanding. Thank you. Next, we have Cristobal Puig. So that gentleman's with the program coordinator, Office of Tenant Advocates. So if you don't mind, share with us a little bit about who you are, your pronouns, and what fair housing means to you. You have the floor.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, I'm Cristobal Puig. I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the DC Office of the Tenant Advocate. My pronouns are he and him. So fair housing, I'm going to stick with the rental accommodations because I'm the Office of the Tenant Advocate. So in the rental accommodations context, without any legalese, it means that any individual in the District of Columbia that's a resident here can have access to, and by that I mean from the application process, can have access to and ultimately rent, live, and enjoy a rental accommodation free from discrimination, of any discrimination, either found in the Fair Housing Act of 1968 or in the Human Rights Statute here in DC. So any tenant, any person who wants to be a tenant in DC, independently of where they're from or any of the protected traits, whether it be the 7 of the Fair Housing Act or the 18 of the Human Rights Act, that they be able to enjoy that free from discrimination, that in the rental accommodations context.
Sandy, thank you for sharing that. And next, Mr. Michael D. Mitchell with International Development Planning. We'd like for you to actually introduce yourself, what your pronouns are, and what does fair housing mean to you? You have the floor.
Well, good evening. I'm Michael D. Mitchell, and it is a pleasure and an honor to be here with OHR because you really are a national leader in fair housing and to produce so much of the national leadership for fair housing. I work with international development and planning, and I train federal, state, and local enforcers of the fair housing laws. My pronouns are he and I guess they. I hope I live long enough to see the day when we don't identify people by their sex or gender. And I think that that's where the pronoun discussion is inevitably going to lead us. Fair housing to me is allowing people to have their housing choice honored, to be able to live where and how they want to live without any barriers or impediments based on their protected class status. And you can see that DC has a lot of protected class statuses, the reasons why people can't be discriminated against in a housing transaction. And we really need to see that that is honored and enforced.
Outstanding, outstanding. Thank you. And again, just in case you all are just joining us, happy Fair Housing Month and welcome to DC's Office of Human Rights Fair Housing Month event. The purpose of this evening event is to actually talk about fair housing and the impact of COVID. So with that, let's actually move into and ask the panelists a few questions. So first question that we actually have, and again, if you have any questions, we're going to ask you to put them into the chat and hold your questions to the end of the remarks being offered by everyone. So the first one is going to deal with COVID, and the pandemic has highlighted a lot of longstanding inequities. How has housing been impacted? And so with that, if you don't mind, we can actually start first with Mr. Evan. So Mr. Evan, if you don't mind, you have the floor, my friend.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, COVID has had, as we all have felt, a myriad of major impacts across the board. From a rental and purchase standpoint, so my forte, and I do way more purchasing than rentals. DC has done a really good job of following fair housing laws. It's really hard to get around that, especially in sales. But what has happened in COVID is we've seen a competitive market become more competitive, become almost impossible to get your foot in the door, especially for those using assistance. If you are writing an offer on a home, if you're looking to purchase or writing an offer on a home and you're using one of the many wonderful DC programs in a competitive situation, you're more than likely not going to win that bid just because of the amount of competition that we're dealing with these days due to lack of inventory and competition. That is the biggest thing that I see as far as fair housing goes. And I know that's a little bit of a gray line because when we talk about competition, sellers have the ability to dictate and determine what they are comfortable with accepting. But the protected class of, income protected class is I think really getting left out in this very competitive market because there's just no sellers are less likely, let me say that, to accept that.
So because we're just speaking about is dealing with the issue of affordable housing, and we were talking about interest rates. We're going to circle back on that, Ms. Evans. So thank you so much. I now want to actually move to Tjuan Stevenson-Woods from Housing Up. What is your impression about how the inequities that exist that have been kind of shown in COVID, how has that impacted the DC market and the people that you serve?
First of all, we know that the largest impact was the loss of income for many. And with the loss of income, that comes with a lot of back rent and late fees for a lot of people. And we know that this has affected mostly the minority families as well as families with children, which has been reported, from 2020 to 2021. For the area that I serve, I'm to make sure that, we're dealing with landlords who are not discriminating against source of income mainly for our clients with housing choice vouchers or rapid rehousing, which is a short-term subsidy that nobody really likes to accept. So I have run into a couple of situations where we do have landlords who told us that they did not want to accept the rapid rehousing. And we know, again, that that is source of income discrimination. So, and with the loss of income, a lot of landlords, with the mortgage companies that they're dealing with, they're losing income. So, they just want long-term subsidy if that's what they're going to use throughout the city.
Sandra, yes. Thank you for that. And I know that, source of income is obviously important for OHR, but I also want to give the floor right now to Director Klein. Director Klein, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. May. So I wanted to just take a moment to introduce another honored guest that I just noticed is in attendance this evening. And that's Mr. Floyd May from the NAACP DC chapter. So I wanted to invite him to say a few words if he'd like, as well as introduce our chair of the Commission on Human Rights, Motoko Aizawa. So Mr. May, you have the floor if you would like to say a few words, please.
Yes, I do. I thought that was the dear gentleman, Mr. Floyd May. So thank you for joining. I was going to wait I was overjoyed to see that you've joined us. This man is actually the one who's actually set up the National Housing Training Academy that actually, he worked at HUD, that actually trains all the fair housing system programs across the country. So it's a joy for you to be here and also chairperson to be here as well. So thank you. We thank both of you for being here. So with that, I want to give the floor to Mr. Floyd May.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jeffrey, Mr. Mitchell, is so glad to see you again. Well, here we are, some years again after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, and I am disturbed to tell you that the picture is not good. The law was passed in '68, amended in '88, and we still have an extreme amount of housing discrimination that occurs. And more concerning and more disturbing, we are demonstrating a lack of will to do anything about it. Annually, we have never had more than 10,000 fair housing complaints filed across this country. And so we have to challenge ourselves to understand, why is that? Why are people tolerant about discrimination? I think it's a real irony today. Many of us are celebrating the announcement of a Black female on the Supreme Court. It's a curious irony that 19 years ago today, April 7th, 2003, the United States Supreme Court that she will be joining made a ruling that the Ku Klux Klan was authorized to burn a cross, but they were not legally allowed to intimidate people. Now, what was the practical demonstration of what that meant? It did not give any real comfort to victim discrimination. But I think that the election today of a Black female Supreme Court judge says a lot about part of our will, but not enough. So I am concerned, and I want to challenge all of us to demonstrate a greater desire and willingness to do something about housing discrimination, because the problem is very distinct and clear danger to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And also, since we have a moment to do so, Chairperson Aizawa, would you mind actually just kind of saying a few things, or sharing a few remarks as well? And thank you, Mr. Floyd, for the annual service, sir. You have the floor, Chairperson.
Thank you, Mr. May, for this opportunity to just say hello. My name is Motoko Aizawa, and I'm the chair of the DC Commission on Human Rights. I just want to tell you two things. Number one, that this commission's role is to form tribunals to adjudicate complaints brought under the DC Human Rights Act, including complaints related to housing. Number two, because we acknowledge that housing is such an important issue currently in Washington, DC, and elsewhere actually in the country. This year, we were very happy to award the Neil Alexander Humanitarian Award, which is an award that the Commission awards every year around the International Human Rights Day on December the 10th. This year, that award went to Christy Respress of A Pathway to Housing DC. We hoped that our act would really underscore the importance of this particular sector and to attract a lot of attention on what the city is already doing, what OHR is already doing, but also what additional things that are needed. So thank you so much for this particular panel today. I think it's very timely. I'm very happy that it's taking place during the Fair Housing Month, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chairperson Azawa. And with that, in that same discussion, discussing the importance of housing and fair housing and its impact, I now want to actually move to Cristobal Puig. Ms. Puig, if you don't mind just sharing with us what you see, how COVID has impacted the people that you're serving with the Tenant Advocate's office.
Absolutely. So what we've seen during the pandemic, in a nutshell, is the polarization of some of the long-standing inequities that we've all been talking about in the rental housing context, right? So for example, the Chief Tenant Advocate always talks about rental housing as an ecosystem, right? So in that ecosystem, you're going to have the housing providers, the tenants, and everything in between. So by polarization, what I mean is that certain housing providers have, because of several reasons, have, for example, allowed their properties to go into disrepair a little bit further. And another thing is a lack of understanding of the public health emergency legislations that were passed by the City Council in order to, let's say, cushion the blows of everything that's happened in the last 2 years. Now, there is a silver lining, though, right? Which is the other side of the same coin, which is that we also saw during this period, basically housing providers and tenants coming together to try to get out of very difficult situations, right? And one very clear example of that is the Stay DC Rental Assistance Program, in which both the housing provider and the tenants had to fill out certain portions of that in order for the tenants to stay in their units during these difficult times, but also for that small or for that housing provider to also recuperate some of those funds in order to continue to provide adequate, safe, and sanitary housing to their tenants. So in a nutshell, it's been the polarization, right? In both in some negative instances, but also the positive instances in which people basically came together and realized that this was in, exceptional circumstances that we've been living in. So they had to take exceptional roles to try to address these issues, right? So that is in a nutshell what we saw.
Outstanding. And I would like, Michael, just to kind of Mr. Michael D. Mitchell to just kind of remark just quickly about this as we move on, how he has observed that the COVID has actually impacted not just DC, but what your view from across the country as well. So Mr. Michael D. Mitchell, you have the floor.
Thank you. And before I answer that question, I just have to acknowledge Mr. Floyd May, who for many years was the highest ranking career employee in fair housing and who has guided us for decades in our fair housing endeavors. And just want to thank him for his service and for his leadership. In terms of the longstanding inequities, we know that there's a long history of our government having policies that created, contributed to, perpetuated, or increased the severity of housing discrimination. And there is a greater impact on communities of color in this COVID pandemic. We know that it's been disproportionate in terms of deaths and hospitalizations, disproportionate in terms of unemployment, in terms of who the essential workers are. A lot of times it's been people of color who can't work from home and are exposed to COVID. And we know that there's been and will probably be even more loss of housing as a result of the pandemic. And we really hope that there won't be another housing crisis as this moratorium expires. We also know there's a greater impact on women and persons with disabilities as a result of the pandemic. And I think that we're going to see foreclosures and evictions being disproportionate as we move forward. And hopefully we can prevent this, prevent the crisis from devastating home ownership, because home ownership is so important to both building wealth for individuals and stabilizing communities. And hopefully we can learn from the mistakes of the lending crisis that we've had just 10 or 15 years ago, so that we can prevent unnecessary foreclosures and home loss, increase access to credit, and make sure that vacant properties don't create blight for our communities, and that we don't see the destabilizing, wealth stripping, credit ruining event as a result of this pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We do now I want to kind of circle back a little bit, because we've been talking about how our clients have been impacted and what, everyone's been given the impressions about how they've seen this impact their respective clients and the community in general. But I do want to, starting with Ms. Tjuan Stevenson-Woods, and then moving to Mr. Puig, and then obviously moving on to Ms. Evans. Ms. Evans, what have you observed in terms of how your clients are being impacted, but what have you as an agency and an organization done to actually assist and address them in the wake of COVID? So Ms. Tjuan Stevenson-Woods, you have the floor.
So for our agency, we just been moving forward with the clients and trying to serve them the best we could with social distancing and not being able to see the clients as we usually will. Everything happened so swiftly. One day we were in an office, and the last 2 years we've been working from home. So for the grace of technology, we've been able to serve our clients through virtual home visits. And for those who are not technical savvy, we've been able to serve those clients, via phone, and just try to do our best. And when we do meet with them, to still stay social distancing with the clients, and teaching them as well to social distance when they're out and about with other people.
Okay, outstanding. Before we actually move on to Mr. Cristobal, has this, in terms of your work and directly with people, have you all been able to mobilize people differently? What have you been doing to actually mobilize folks in this environment, I guess?
So of course, people still have to be housed, right? So we still have to make provisions and getting people housed, and make sure that we are in DC trying to uphold the mayor's standards to clear up our homelessness in DC, especially our street homeless. So we have still been able to do virtual viewings with the clients. We have been able to do virtual inspections for the units that the clients are moving into. So, sad to say, but working from home works, and works, and we've been able to still move, and our percentage of housing our clients really didn't drop. We just still have to make sure that we are still, looking out for the community and getting the clients housed.
Outstanding. And Mr. Puig, and thank you for that, Ms. Stevens. Mr. Puig, can you share with us how you all have pivoted and the services that you all offer, just so that people can understand what you've been doing and what you all have been doing?
Absolutely. So the Office of the Tenant Advocate was founded basically in 2006 as part of DCRA, and then in 2007 we became an independent DC government agency that is charged by statute with providing legal services to tenants in the district, policy advocacy, emergency housing program in limited circumstances, and then education and community outreach. So that is basically the statutory mission of the Office of the Tenant Advocate. Now, I am the education and outreach coordinator, so I'm going to plug the education and outreach in the sense that and actually this is the reason why I transitioned from the policy department to this. One of the best and most effective and efficient ways to stamp out discrimination in the housing context and all other contexts is education, right? People who know their rights cannot be taken advantage of as easily as people who do not. And that, at the end of the day, is one of the core mission of my, little universe at OTA, which is helping tenants understand their rights. And that is super important. Now, the other branches have also had significant work during the pandemic, right? For example, our policy branch has advocated for the Eviction Record Sealing Authority and Fairness in Renting Amendment Act, right? And among other things, that basically provides that the courts need to seal eviction records, both discretionary and mandatory. So there's two different variants for that. But it also allows, for example, a tenant to bring a civil action against a housing provider if they discriminated against them, against the potential tenant because of a sealed eviction record, right? So if the housing provider sees the sealed eviction record and they say, nope, we're not going to rent to you, well, that's also a form of discrimination. And our policy department worked to basically guide the city council and other stakeholders to pass laws that help curb barriers both to renting, because an eviction record is a barrier to renting. So that's another thing that our policy department did throughout the pandemic, help draft laws that start taking away those barriers to renting. And it goes without saying that our legal branch during the pandemic saw a significant increase in requests for assistance from the tenant community in DC. And again, any tenant in the District of Columbia calls our office and we'll respond. So that is, in a nutshell, what we've experienced throughout the pandemic.
Thank you for that. And now I actually want to pivot to our realtor. And so, Mr. Evan Lee Marbury, how have you had to pivot or change in terms of your practices to really assist those persons to obviously see houses and be able to take advantage of being able to buy homes? What have you had to do?
We haven't had to pivot much. I think in the beginning, of COVID, virtual showings and things were a thing. I think the biggest pivot, honestly, is that everybody got busier. And so the pivot was, how do we manage to assist all of our clients equally with the same amount of time in the day? So I know, yeah, that was the biggest thing.
That's a big pivot. So I do, before we actually leave that, because I feel like there's some really powerful information that you were sharing earlier about the market itself and about how things have changed literally in the past 6 months. What would you say to people in terms of our audience, things that they need to be mindful of in terms of if they started that process of accessing housing, interested in buying housing, and if they're pursuing it now, what would you share with them?
So I'd say I have a couple sayings that I say to all of my clients. So the biggest one is if you sleep on it, you won't sleep in it, right? And so in a market like this, you need to be decisive and quick. But for people that are unaware, we are in an ever-changing financial market in regards to interest rates and things like that. So if you were looking 6 months ago, it had a buying power of, I don't know, $400,000. Your buying power is probably significantly less now due to an extreme climb in interest rates, specifically if you're using down payment assistance by the District of Columbia. So just be really cognizant of those things, aware, be with someone, have a lender and a realtor in your corner that really know those things, know how to navigate that and be proactive instead of being reactive.
Indeed. I think you were remarking about, and I recall we were at 3.25. That was like 6 months ago, or maybe even
we were at
2.7.
We were at 2.75 in December.
And now I think you were saying you quoted what, 6?
DC opens doors today with 6.65.
6.65. That's 3 times the amount. That's extraordinary. That's a huge impact.
That's with no money down. I mean, there's some caveats, but
yeah, still that's going to have a huge impact on your spending power and your buying power and your monthly payments.
I mean, we're talking payment changes of between like $400 and $600 a month.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
So now we want to actually move on, and actually, because we have about 10 minutes and then we want to actually open it up for questions. I want to actually put this question, and I'll actually start with Michael in terms of what resource, because you're looking at this from the national perspective, but also looking at it and how it impacts the District of Columbia. What role do you see that government, and I would say as well as the private sector, have in closing the fair housing gaps that we've been talking about, we remarked about earlier, those inequities in that history that was remarked about by Mr. Brown?
Well, I think they got off to a good start with the CARES Act money and initiatives, the foreclosure and eviction moratorium and protection, some of the other initiatives that have come out of HUD. I think they need to double down on the housing counseling. I think scams are starting to become an issue, and we need to clamp down on scams. We need to have quality post-forbearance options. I think the key to all of this is to promote home ownership and to make sure that people are not losing their homes. And to the extent that they have lost their homes, make sure that there aren't barriers to them getting back into home ownership at some point. We owe a great debt to those essential workers that kept our economy working and kept our housing market afloat. We need to give them down payment assistance. We need to ease some of the risk-based pricing. We need to rethink some of the credit scoring that's disadvantageous to working class people. And we need to allow people to access the equity in their homes. With these home prices going up, those that are homeowners have a lot of equity in their homes, but haven't been able to access that. There are also a lot of resources by the federal government and Treasury Department, CFPB, HUD, USA.gov that give us a lot of the resources that are out there. And I'm gonna put some of those links in the chat so that people can take advantage of that. And of course, in DC, there is Stay DC, which has been essential in keeping people in DC and in their homes.
Thank you. And I'd like to actually open that question out to the other panelists as well. So if you don't mind, I'd like to start with Mr. Tjuan Stevenson-Woods. What role do you think that the private sector and government should actually take to actually close that gap of the fair housing issues, those inequities that we were remarking about? You have the floor, Mr. Tjuan.
Thank you. First, I would say to come up with some type of formula to end racial disparity. Once we can come up with a formula in ending racial disparity, then we can see more safe and affordable housing that can be increased. Then homelessness can be reduced, as well as housing discrimination. I think also equitability and increase of access of credit, just as Mr. Mitchell mentioned.
Excellent, thank you. And Mr. Puig, for the same question to you, what role do you think that the private sector and government agencies should actually undertake to really close and address that fair housing gap? You have the floor, my friend.
Absolutely, thank you. So I'm going to start with the government because, well, there we go. So the first thing is the Office of the Tenant Advocate. Again, I'm going to go back to the education, right? We have doubled the efforts to get out into the community now that we can, right? Because for about a year and a half, we couldn't. So education and outreach is number one, right? Like I said earlier, people who know what their rights are, you can't fool somebody if they know that they have rights. So that's number one, right? And that's the mission of my mission, and the mission of my team is to do exactly that, to help every tenant in the district, one, know that we're available as a resource, and then two, know their rights. So that it almost goes by default. Other than that, there's two other things that the government can do, right? Is find loopholes in acting in laws that are enforced right now and help close those, right? By amending different laws and well, that's a further discussion, right? And then the next one is just more enforcement, right? Enforcement actions when these things are identified. So in terms of the private sector, I would say that, at the end of the day, there's rental housing, again, is an ecosystem, and it includes everybody from the housing provider to the tenants. So I'm going to go back to the education, right? If property managers know what tenants' rights are and what their rights and obligations are, well, that improves that ecosystem, right? Because again, it's everybody's included in that ecosystem. So I'm going to just go back to education, right? And I got to plug that because it's my little group. But education, right? If the private sector, if property managers, property management companies, et cetera, know what their rights and their obligations are, and there's no question of that, that moves the ball forward significantly. So that would be from OTA standpoint and my education and outreach standpoint.
Thank you, Mr. Puig. Thank you for that. And so, Mr. Evan Lee Marbury, I'm going to ask you the same question, which is, what do you see the private sector? I guess specifically, you can speak about realtors because that's what you are a member of the real estate community. But even broader than that, what do you see government and the private sector should do to really close that gap, that fair housing gap that exists, those inequities that we remarked about?
I think just piggybacking on kind of what the other panelists were saying, credit relief. I think that's major, and guidelines behind who can qualify and what they can qualify. Well, not what they can qualify for, but who qualifies and what dings them in relation to mortgages, I think is major. And I think just opening more. I mean, this is like a snowball, but affordable housing, more programs, more funds, things of that nature. DC does a really, in my opinion, on a sales perspective, in comparison to realtor friends in other cities, really good job of making things accessible for people that qualify for them, as relation to DPA, so down payment assistance. But there's always room for improvement for sure.
Indeed. Thank you. And in the time that we actually have left, because we do want to make sure that we have enough time for questions and be able to entertain questions, I would like to actually start with Director Kine, if she's available to actually address this. Based upon it in terms of what government can do and what the private sector can do as well, what do you see in terms of resources that your wonderful office that actually provides that can actually deal with actually closing that gap, that fair housing gap that we've been talking about? And I would like to kind of throw out there as well, the affirmative furthering for housing part of this, because you do have an analysis of impediments that you all have put together, that DC has actually put together as well. So with that being, and that's specifically for United States Code 3608 E and D5, but that's affirmative furthering for housing. But I'm sorry for the long question, Director Kine, but what do you see are the resources that are available to really close that gap that we were speaking about, those inequities? And so with that, Director Kine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. May. I will work my way backwards. So with respect to government resources, generally speaking, I'm going to piggyback off of Mr. Puig there. I also agree that education is a huge component of eradicating any kind of discrimination, right? And I should say reducing, because I don't know that we can ever eradicate it, but reducing discrimination. And so I would add one more thing to that ecosystem that Mr. Puig was mentioning. So we have the housing provider, we have tenants, then we have all the other players in between that also have to get educated. People that do background checks, people that run those credit reports, those middle people, those folks also need to get educated on the expansive coverage of protected areas that we have in the district, right? And so OHR is working towards that, and that's why we try to do these sessions to broaden our reach. We have what's called the Human Rights Liaison Training to, again, expand our outreach and build community ties and partnerships so that we have sort of human rights ambassadors out there spreading the words about what is prohibited. So again, as Mr. Puig pointed out, it's not just enough that our residents and applicants understand their rights, but it's also, and maybe even more important, that housing providers and their employees, every single one of them, they understand what is not lawful in the District of Columbia. So I think that's really key. And so I'm going to do a little plug here. So part of our Fair Housing Month, we're going to have what's called Listening Lab at the end of the month. We had these sessions back in 2018. They were wildly successful. Pandemic happened, and we're bringing it back. We had our first session earlier in April, I want to say. And so we're going to have this next one where the point of those conversations is to hear from the communities about the challenges they're experiencing from them individually and what we can do, because we can sit here and speculate about what the problems are as experts, but it's good to hear from the individual community members. And further, what we're going to do as OHR, beyond just our mission to provide adjudication and enforce laws that prohibit discrimination, we want to connect people with resources. The district and Mayor Bowser has invested a number of resources and funding for people to gain wealth and build wealth through housing and housing opportunities. And so, we want to make sure that residents are able to connect with those resources. And so that's why these listening labs and outreach sessions that we have are so important and vital. And we thank you all for doing this panel discussions to raise these awareness around those resources. So I hope I answered all of the questions. So I mean, in some, to wrap it up, I think there are different sort of angles at which we can approach this. But in short, I would say we have to work together to make sure that there is no housing gaps for communities of color.
Outstanding, outstanding. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Director Kind. We are at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, so we did want to start, to entertain questions. So we're going to see if we have any questions. If not, I will continue asking questions of our esteemed panel. So with that, I do want to ask Mr. Brown. I think I saw 1 or 2 questions as I was kind of scrolling through things. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat. So this one is from Joanne K. She's asking if about appraisal bias. So appraisal bias, how can this be prevented? And I think this is probably for anyone that wants to answer.
Yeah. So I do want to, before I open the floor on it, HUD has actually undertaken a property appraised value task force, and it's actually it's a star-studded. I need to point out. I mean, you have Susan Rice, you have Melody Taylor, you have people from Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, HUD's Office of Fair Housing Equal Opportunity, Department of Labor, Department of Justice, to deal with this issue of appraisal discrimination. You may have seen a number of stories of African Americans and Hispanic Latino households having to whitewash their home. What does a whitewash mean? That means that taking down their pictures of their loved ones that actually are people of color and actually putting up pictures of people who are non-people of color, for the reason, unfortunately, which is a horrible decision that they have to make, so that they can actually gain hopefully a higher valuation, because unfortunately the act of discrimination by appraisers are not based upon the value of the structure and the comparables of homes that are similar to it, but unfortunately who are the people who are residing, the inhabitants of the property, is actually unfortunately playing a discriminatory role in the value, so much so that we've seen, unfortunately, $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 difference in the decrease in the value of the home. The issue of how we can actually address that, I know that PAVE has actually been dealing with that, but I'd first like to actually ask Mr. Michael D. Mitchell to actually remark about it, and then open it up to the larger panel. So with that, Mr. Michael D. Mitchell, you have the floor, my friend.
I think you gave a good overview of that, and I'm going to put in some resources in the chat related to PAVE. We've had a long history of unequal appraisals that have stopped transactions from happening in Black communities and Latinx communities. We've had people be unable to refinance their homes because appraisals are undervaluing those communities. And so really pleased to see that this administration is taking this on and in a big way. And we will see. I think that people really should try to get involved in this and give support to this effort, because it's an important one if we're ever going to have home ownership rise to the level that it should in our communities.
Thank you, thank you. I now want to open it to other panelists to see, to offer your remarks as well. So does anyone else, or would anyone else like to chime in right now? The floor is open.
I think appraisal education is really important. A lot of times banks are sending these third-party appraisers to communities that they've never been to and don't understand. We've yet to see $1 million house appraised in Southeast, which is, in my opinion, outrageous.
That is.
So, I mean,
beautiful homes.
I live in Hillcrest. We got $1 million houses over here. It is what it is. But they're sending these appraisers from McLean and Arlington and Rockville and wherever you want to be. So I think a couple of us, a lot of the realtors that sell in Ward 7 and Ward 8 have come together and been speaking to these lenders about who they're sending out here. I think we have one coming. I cross your fingers, everybody. I think we have one coming in the next couple of weeks that'll appraise over $1 million. So maybe that'll be the barrier, but to me, it's about appraisal education.
Thank you, thank you. I do want to, did anyone else want to remark, or can I move on to the next question? Because I see that we have several questions. All right, Mr. Brown, our next question.
Yes, sir. So the next question is from LaShawn, and it's saying, asking what is being done for the disabled community, particularly for rental properties?
Excellent, excellent. So just so everyone knows, the leading basis, according to HUD's annual report, the leading basis of discrimination that people file complaints is actually disability. It's actually been this way for about, I would say, at least 7 to 8 years now, that the leading basis that people file discrimination complaints, housing discrimination complaints, is actually disability. Behind that is race. And, you know, again, everyone needs to be mindful. I think as I look at the number and recall the numbers in the District of Columbia Office of Human Rights, I think your numbers are similar as well. So that being said, I'd like to again open the floor to either Mr. Brown or Director Kind to actually remark about it, but then open it up to the larger panel.
So I can just chime in and piggyback off that. That is also, so our numbers do mirror the federal sort of stats that you just quoted, and where disability is one of the leading sort of basis for discrimination complaints that we get in housing. And I could just say that we are, working with our government partners on, again, and a lot of that has been brought up tonight has been education. And I totally agree that, as we're educating folks on these different laws and protections, there's less of a chance that they'll be discriminated against. And so again, we're going to be leveraging our partnerships with our sister agencies like the Office of Disability Rights, putting on clinics and trainings, specifically for that community, because we do recognize that it is a vulnerable community. And in pre-pandemic, we've done a lot of work again with those offices, with this disability community, in spreading awareness around those rights. And so we will continue that, moving forward to partially answer the question.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, go ahead. Director Khan, you have the floor.
I think someone had a question.
Okay, yes.
yes.
Oh, I thought, okay. Yes.
Yeah, I just had a question. As for the disability people, say they're in a position, I'm part of mutual aid and we help people with disabilities, but a lot of them are living in situations with like mold and et cetera, et cetera. They run the risk of having retaliation happen against them. So is the statute of limitations to form the complaint still a year, or can it be extended? Because a lot of times they want to leave the unit before they, file the complaint, because they don't want to have any type of retaliation happen.
So with that, Director Khan, would you like to take that question?
Sure. So I was going to address a number of things, but I'll start with then. I think Ms. Smith also had another question in the chat that I was going to address. So with regard to disability cases, it is 1 year. With regard to Ms. Smith's question earlier in the chat about source of income, I was actually looking for our numbers as we were talking about the most sort of raised allegations in our complaints in FY 20 21. And so it is disability, race, and source of income. So Ms. Smith, your question is very timely about, you said, what do you do about individuals who are being denied voucher or denied rental because of their use of voucher, and the issue about not meeting income guidelines or restrictions. And so this is why source of income discrimination is so important for us to understand, and that's why we have that guidance. So Asian, if we haven't dropped it already, please drop our guidance document on source of income discrimination. It goes through all of that, and there's some Q&As in there. But Ms. Smith, please contact our office. Your clients, or the individuals that you work with may have a claim with our office. So please reach out to our office, and we'd be happy to see whether or not there's a claim to be docketed at our office.
Okay, thank you.
And the other thing I want to say is in terms of addressing these, most sort of raised allegations in complaints, one of the goals for OHR this year and into FY23 is for our communications team, which includes Asian Brown and Tyler, who's on the call today, to tailor our outreach based on these issues that we find at the end of the year. So when we find that race and disability and source of income are the greatest numbers that we see in our complaints, we want to tailor our outreach and education materials to that. So we're working on that.
I would just add on the statute of limitations that you have 1 year to file administratively. So with OHR or with HUD, you have 2 years to file in state or federal court. Now, I know that's a little difficult because you need to have attorneys, but as an organization, you may be able to do that, particularly if you have a large housing provider that is systemically or routinely violating either the fair housing laws or other laws, to get an attorney and to take not necessarily a class action, but establish some type of a pattern or practice or systemic discrimination by that housing provider in court.
And while we're on that topic, I do want to also underscore and make because we're here with Office of Human Rights, your clients who are disabled, or any clients for that matter, if they believe that they're experiencing housing discrimination, it doesn't cost them anything to actually go to the Office of Human Rights and actually file your complaint and actually seek the assistance. You have an enforcement agency, a fair housing enforcement agency that covers and serves your jurisdiction. So you have a powerful, powerful resource in OHR. So with that, I just want to do that. I just want to understand.
Thank you for that. Go ahead, Mr. Puig. I was going to add one more comment, but you go ahead.
No, not at all. Director, after you.
Well, I was just going to say, Mr. Mitchell's comment reminded me of, looking at practice and pattern issues, that OHR is undertaking a study on source of income discrimination in the district. And so we've done part 1 in FY21, and FY22, we're going to be doing another study, and we're going to build on that. So that's part of an example of how we're addressing the sort of information that we're getting from our filings, is to, when we know that source of income is a prevalent issue, then we're looking into it by doing a greater study, because our numbers don't necessarily indicate that that's the most prevalent issue, but it might be. So we're doing a study to see what's happening and what we can do to address the issues that we uncover when we complete our study. So I just wanted to share that with the public.
Thank you, Director Kine. And Mr. Puig, you have the floor, my friend.
Thank you. I just want to address one thing that Ms. Smith mentioned earlier. She said that some of her tenant clients were living in areas with mold and units with mold and all of this. So that is a housing code violation, right? You cannot have mold in a residential rental unit. So before you get to the fair housing issue, you can have those individuals call our office, because mold is a violation of the Air Quality Amendment Act of 2014, I believe. And then the underlying causes of mold, leaky pipes, windows that don't close, are a housing code violation. So you can definitely have any of your clients call our office, and we can address those issues with you, our case managers or attorney advisors. And that's all I had to say about it.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Just wanted to add, a lot of the problem is when we try to get this addressed, or we'll call it an office, the problem is the housing provider will retaliate and scare the disabled person. So the retaliation is very real. They'll threaten them with illegal eviction. They'll do a whole bunch of stuff. So then the person will renege on it and say, oh, no, I don't want to, that's a common problem.
And I would encourage, again, them actually contacting Office of Human Rights, because retaliation is actually something that is prohibited. So it's actually in the statute. So again, when the client comes and actually speaks with someone at OHR, they will explain to them, just as we're sharing with you, that not only is the act of discrimination against the person with a disability prohibited and putting them in those conditions and those housing code violations, but also if they take adverse action because they've exercised their right, their fair housing right, they are also protected underneath the jurisdiction's ordinance. So with that, did anyone from OHR want to remark a bit further about that?
Yes, you must have read my mind, Mr. May. So I was just going to add that when we get cases like that, Ms. Smith, where individuals are threatened with eviction based on any kind of protected activity, like Mr. May was saying, either complaining about a human rights or fair housing issue, OHR can work with the Office of the Attorney General to seek an injunction against irreparable harm, which is things like eviction. So make sure that if you're working with your individual clients, that you advise them of that, that remedy that's available at OHR.
Can I also add?
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
This is
Ms. Swan,
Tjuan.
you have
Can
the
I
floor.
also
Yeah, you have
add
the floor.
about something about the discrimination on the source of income? I would say, please, please, please report this to OHR. Asian and I had a very lengthy conversation about this a couple of weeks ago, and I have been doing OHR trainings for maybe the past 5 years. So liaison, and I've been able to advocate for my clients being a housing provider. We ran into a large property where, again, they didn't want to accept a particular type of subsidy. Once I provided information to the manager of this company, I think we came to some type of agreement that discrimination was, the source of income discrimination was totally illegal. And I've been able to project this with a couple of other landlords who just did not know, because they get word of mouth, oh, you can rent your property, and they don't get all of the information that's needed to be a renter or to, to be a landlord. So please, please report this information. Also with the mold situation, DCRA works closely with OTA as well. When it comes to those type of situations, DCRA will come out, do an investigation. They will get with OTA, and also they will put that unit in abatement. So make sure that we are definitely following up with these agencies who are here in DC to help us. It's so many other states that don't have this type of resource. So please do.
Indeed, indeed. Go ahead.
I'll definitely follow up with all of you guys, because like, for example, we had someone who had rats in their issue, and they followed up with DCRA. The place was, it failed inspection, basically. And then they got served paperwork with the eviction. So these are the kind of situations that happen all the time. And then another situation is situations where voucher holders in Ward 3 are being placed on the last floor, the basement floor. So they get the least desirable units, which are prone to mold and other issues. So it's just really kind of messed up.
Indeed.
Yeah, we want to go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I don't want to take away from anyone else's questions. We have a few more questions. But yeah, I would certainly want to connect with you, and I can give you all of the panelists' information. So let's connect, and I'll follow up with you in regards to those different issues that you brought up. So I thank you for bringing those up too. But we do have a question from Kevin Johnson, and he said, my question is about tax credit properties in DC and discrimination. I'm not exactly sure. You might want to sort of flesh that out a little bit, but if anyone is able to answer that question. So tax credit properties in DC and discrimination, if there's anyone of the panelists want to take that, or you want to fill that, Mr. May.
So I would like them to actually kind of flesh that out, because that's a form of public support in that respect. So what form of discrimination are you seeing in that? Is it citing of it? Are they not taking Section 8, which would be a violation of the local ordinance? But if the person who actually raised that question, if you mind kind of fleshing out a bit further, because you have experts who can answer it.
Absolutely. In the meantime, I'm going to move to the if you could flesh that out, please drop that in the chat. I'm going to move on to the next questions. We have a few more. So this is from Miranda. As a first-time home buyer, how would I know I'm being discriminated against during the home buying process? What signs should I look for? How should I document discrimination, and where should I report? So I think that's appropriate question for Director Kine, or if you want
Yes,
me to.
that's what I was gonna ask. I was gonna ask the call OHR is my response.
Right.
Director Khan, you have the floor. Director Khan,
Thank you. I can certainly talk about it from filing perspective, which is, yes, indeed, call us. You can file complaints by calling us, filing it online, faxing, hard copy mailing. So there are various options to file complaints at our office. So Asian, if you wouldn't mind dropping our links to filing housing
Sure.
complaints in the chat, I think that'd be very helpful. Spotting discrimination. So that's a really good question. And one thing that I always say is discrimination is about treating people differently because of their protected basis, right? So race, source of income, whatever it may be. So if you or you know someone who is experiencing a different treatment in buying a home or renting a home, then that may be a sign that there is discrimination occurring. So I would say that that's a major way of identifying discrimination. And I would also defer to Mr. Marbury, who might have maybe seen discrimination as a real estate agent, and what his suggestions are for spotting discrimination in home buying.
Ms. Evan, you have the floor.
Oh, you're on silent. You're on silent.
Sorry.
Happens to all of us.
I saw this question come in and I've been thinking of an answer. I would say my answer to your question would be to talk to your real estate professional about it. I find it very hard to determine unless it's like overly blatant in home purchase. I find it very hard to be able to navigate and see if it's not blatant discrimination. Like I said previously, I do think that there is some prejudice or less desire to take offers from programs, government-funded programs in the District of Columbia. And so we're talking about HPAP, EHAP, DC Opens Doors, even there's one more that I just blanked out on. Sellers usually in this market are less likely to take those. But I would say really just reach out to your real estate professional, get their insight. They would be a better resource because it's such a case-by-case situation.
What I might offer and just add just quickly is that your real estate agent is the one who's interacting with the prospective buyer. Typically, if you are not just calling someone on your own, but that difference that Director Kine spoke about, which is, let's say it's listed on the market at a certain price, just as Mr. Evans has been remarking about, you're in a hot market, and you just, when you're talking, whether you're communicating directly to them or your agent is communicating directly with him, her, or them, and you just seem that information that's being offered, it's being very limited, or they're not wanting to share that information with you. The room to negotiate seems like in a hot market, it's going to be very difficult to do so. However, you're looking for that lack of cooperation or lack of information, even allowing you to see it. They may not even want you to, because they may determine that your realtor may be a person of color as well. And so therefore they may say, well, look, it's not available. Even though when you look at the MLS, the multiple listing services or real estate listing services, you still see that the property is available. So again, it's those differences that Director Kine was speaking about. And your realtor, to Mr. Evans' point, that's going to, him, her, he, she, they're going to be the ones principally interacting. And they may say to you, this seems strange. I put in a bid, or we're trying to get you to see it. And now all of a sudden they're giving me to run around. They're not returning my phone call. So therefore that may be something that's at play, because you can't imagine that they're treating everyone that way because they're trying to sell the unit. So.
I would say though, also hold your realtor accountable, because there are also some times where realtors are unfamiliar with certain areas or certain programs. And we like you just said, we have all of the information. We know the ins and the outs. And so I've seen, I'm not going to show them this because they're not going to get it anyway. And so also in that regard, it might not just be the seller. It could be the person that is working for you. So just be very cognizant about that as well.
And if I may, Mr. May and
Of
Asian,
course.
I want to add two specific examples that have jumped into my mind because of the conversations we're having. So two examples that I've seen come up in housing discrimination as it relates to real estate transactions is when you're signing that contract and putting up that contract is supposed to get ratified and it doesn't, or there's a contingency provision and they say no contingencies, but then someone else has a contingency provision and that contract gets ratified. So those are the sort of differences that you want to look for in sale of homes with respect to contract writing. What's happening? Are they being consistent and being compliant with the provisions that you've already agreed to? Are they trying to wiggle their way out of it? So that's sort of one signal. The other situation I've seen is with respect to co-op homes, where sometimes in a co-op settings, they may have certain rules that may be discriminatory. And so you may only become aware of it after you start to explore what rules exist within the co-op, right? So, home buying in co-ops is a lot different than home buying with respect to single family homes or even with condos. And so you want to be careful with co-op transactions as well.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kai.
So the
And,
next question we
yes, thank you.
have is directed at Mr. Marbury, and it's from Ivory Smith. If I can actually scroll to them, sorry. It says this question is for Evan with oops, just went past it. Of course. Sorry, bear with me. I'm essentially asking about the interest rate and it being so high, and how long do you think that will last in our current market?
Who, I couldn't tell you.
But if you had a crystal ball, if you could, what would you think? Do you think it's going away soon?
I mean, it's interesting because I'm a millennial, and so all millennials are very nervous about interest rates because we don't know anything above 4.5%. When my parents bought their house, it was 18%.
Yeah.
Anything under 5 is fine, but we've gotten into this bubble of, especially in COVID, like, 2.5, 2.25, anything above 3.5 is no, it's still a great interest rate. We've just gotten accustomed to it. I think it's probably going to stay around 4 for a while. I think that's fair. Like I said, we've just gotten accustomed to it not being that way. But I wish I knew. I wish I had a clearer answer. But speaking with lenders and things, it'll be around for a while. I don't see it going anywhere. I mean, with the price of gas, with everything in Ukraine, like it's interest rates had to go up. We have inflation. Like, this is what is happening.
And I think there's a silver lining to that. As interest rates go up, some of the housing prices may come down, and
I don't
people
think
may be
prices
able
will
to
come
afford
down.
it.
I don't know if prices will come down. I think competition will be less, though.
So, because DC is a very hot market, everyone.
DC is DC.
You're in a very hot market.
So many people work for the government. The government always gets paid. So, like, DC is a market in which I don't see it level. And I think certain neighborhoods will level. I think Petworth is like capped. I think we've seen kind of that happen, but now, like I said, now we're seeing potentially $1 million houses in Southeast, and so you never really know.
Indeed.
I live in Fort Washington, and I just did a refinance on my home in December. So I contemplated, but thank God I did it. So I'm not in this 6% group. But however, what my house appraised for, I would have never thought. So I think the thing with DC, the market in DC is trickling over here to us in Fort Washington. So I'm seeing a great deal of people coming from DC and moving to this area, but now it's almost flooded in this area. And I'm close to the harbor as well, so.
I think that trend's gonna continue. I know Mr. Puig was remarking about, in terms of all of our collective housing choices, but we see that this phenomenon of the gentrification and prices rising across the country, and DC, it's quite acute. that we are at our time at 7:30. Did you want to
Mhm.
Mr. Jason, did you want to entertain any more questions, or what should we?
Yeah, we
what
have,
would you
so
like?
we have one more question from our Facebook Live audience, actually. So I want to thank everyone that's tuning in on our Facebook Live, on our Facebook page.
Excuse me, Asian, I can tell you, it is from HC, Housing Council Services, HCS,
Mhm.
HCS, yes.
Yeah, so this is from Ronald Clarkson, who's the Communications Director at Housing Counseling Services. And he's asking to support Mr. Puig's emphasis on education. Can you share OHR's understanding of whether COVID-19 is considered a disability in the fair housing context?
Okay, which is like,
And then I
we
don't
can
know
help
if
out with that too. And wait, Floyd's here as well. So, I mean, it is a disability, but the issues can be the severity of it. We need to be pondering that. Persons who are HIV or AIDS, who have AIDS, their symptoms may not be pronounced, but at some point they can become manifested. So it is a think about the definition of a disease, of a disability. One or more activities that daily life and daily life ADLs are impacted or limited or restricted. So I think many of us are aware that it's a fatal disease. It's a fatal disease, and then it can be quite debilitating with the long haulers symptoms. So it is a disability. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
I would just add, no, thank you, Mr. May. I'm glad you chimed in. I would just say that, as you know, what we've seen with COVID is that it can impact people differently. And so depending, like you said, on the severity of the impact on your daily life function, it could very well be a disability.
Thank you. But I think those are all the questions that we have. I think now we can go ahead and wrap up. So Director Kine, if you want to say some closing remarks, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And before I do, if Ms. Monica from the EEOC is also here, so I don't know if she wanted to say a word to share the work of the EEOC or any latest developments. Monica, you have the floor if you'd like to say a word or two. Well, she may have stepped out, but given that it is 7:33, so, oh, maybe there she is. Monica, are you with us? Oh, I think she, there she is.
I just stepped out to let the cat in. Oh my goodness. Did you call on me? I apologize.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to give you a few minutes if you wanted to say anything about the EEOC, since you're representing the EEOC here on the call.
Well, I appreciate that opportunity. It's been a pleasure to be here. We are partners with the Office of Human Rights. I really enjoy working with Agent. I enjoy the partnership, and I just am very appreciative of this event. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. And Mr. May, I see you have your hand up.
I do. I want, on behalf of the NAACP.
Uh-oh, you're cutting out.
You're breaking up a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah, you got your we can hear you. Go ahead, my friend.
Okay. Not only do I want to thank you all, but I want to encourage you to sponsor more programming like this so that we could develop some collaborative strategies to address our problem. We have the law, we have laws, we have money, we have history, but we do not have a committed position of intolerance for discrimination of all kinds, and specifically in housing, as we are addressing now. And so it's going to require a commitment for us to move forward together to develop programming that will encourage persons to become less tolerant of discrimination, and for us to stand in a way to demonstrate our capacity to address the problem. And so that requires that we will have to have greater ability to communicate more often and find out what things are occurring that we need to be not only concerned about, but developing strategies to address. Thank you for sponsoring this.
Indeed.
Thank you,
indeed.
Mr. May.
Indeed, and I also, if you don't mind, Director, can I also give the floor to Chairperson Azawa, any
course.
closing remarks as well?
Well, thank you. Actually, it's past 7:30, so I don't need to take up everybody's time. I just think this is such an insightful panel that equips people with information and resources. So I hope that people will now participate in other events around this month, including our listening lab on this topic at the end of the month. And again, thank you very much for allowing me to take part in this wonderful panel.
And well, we thank you, and thank you for your leadership. And with that, I'm going to give the floor back to Director Kine and to close us out.
Thank you. And so I'll just say one last walk away thought, which is that there is a little bit of a misconceived notion about the laws, which is that folks tend to believe that federal law is sort of supreme. And it's true in many instances, but when it comes to anti-discrimination laws, Federal Fair Housing Act is actually the floor. It's not the ceiling. So DC Human Rights Act, the local law, is actually supreme because of the protections that it provides. So I would say, if you're walking away from this session today, when you're talking to people, educate them about the fact that the DC Human Rights Act has 18 protected traits, and there are many, many more areas the Human Rights Act covers that the Fair Housing Act does not. So with that, I want to thank our very fantastic moderator, Mr. May. Wasn't he just fabulous? Please give him a larger round of applause.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Please give him a round of applause. Mr. Marbury for his real estate insight. Please give him a round of applause. Ms. Woods, great questions. And I thank you so much for bringing up about the education and the resources that you've gotten from OHR. I hope you'll spread the word about the work that we're doing, and the more people we can get to attend these sort of events, including our human rights liaison trainings, the more we can work together, like Mr. May was saying, Mr. Floyd May was saying, to eradicate or mitigate discrimination and reduce discrimination in the city. So thank you so much for your work and for being here today. Please give her a round of applause. And last but not least, please thank also our esteemed panelist, Mr. Puig from OTA. His team does such a great job, such an important role, government sponsored role in advocating for tenants and their rights. So it's really, really hugely important that we recognize and realize their role in this as well. So thank you, Mr. Puig, for being here. And we look forward to future events together. And with that, I won't take any more of anyone's time. Thank you, Team OHR, which is Asian Brown, Tyler Cargill, Maya Visvari, Dr. Mia Carey, who was also on the call. Did I miss anyone else, team?
That's us.
Asian?
And I have just right before you go, thank you again for attending. Again, we're having another, so you can continue the celebration of fair housing. Later this month, we're having some listening lab on fair housing on Thursday, April 28th. It's going to be at the MLK Library, so it will be an in-person event. We really look forward to hearing from you. We want to hear from landlords and real estate agents, developers. We really want to sort of open the floor and continue this very great discussion that we had tonight in person, and get your ideas on what Mr. Floyd May talked about, is mobilizing and finding solutions to some of these long-standing issues that we have. But we need everyone's input to do so. And so we really want you to come out and let your voice be heard. So again, thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening and happy Fair Housing Month again.
Happy Fair Housing Month, everyone.
Happy Fair Housing Month. Thank you, everybody.
Fair housing.
Yes.